The Leaning Tower Tragedy. On October 23, 2006, 48-year-old Todd Skinner stood at the summit of the Leaning Tower in Yosemite National Park, California. He had just completed a grueling climb with his longtime friend and climbing partner, Jim Hewitt. The two veterans had conquered some of the world's most challenging routes together, from Patagonia to Pakistan. This tower, a 2,200-foot granite monolith, was just another day's work for men of their caliber. Todd was one of the most accomplished climbers of his generation. He had opened new routes, pushed the limits of free climbing, and survived situations that would have killed lesser climbers. But on this sunny October afternoon, standing at the top of what should have been a routine climb, something was about to go catastrophically wrong. The descent began normally. Todd clipped into his harness and prepared to rappel down the fixed ropes. Jim watched as his partner leaned back, transferring his weight to the system. Then, without warning, a sharp snap echoed across the granite face. Todd's belay loop, the critical piece of webbing connecting his harness to the rope, had completely severed. In an instant, he was falling backward into open air. Jim lunged forward, but there was nothing to grab. Todd plummeted 500 feet down the sheer granite wall, his body tumbling through space before disappearing from sight. The silence that followed was devastating. Jim called out, but received no response. He was alone on the summit, knowing his best friend had just fallen to his death below. There was no way down, except to continue rappelling on the same system that had just failed. When rescue teams finally reached Todd's body at the base of the wall, they began their investigation. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the climbing community. The belay loop on Todd's harness had been worn down to almost nothing, abraded by years of use until it was barely thicker than a few threads. It's estimated the loop had less than 20% of its original strength remaining. Todd Skinner, a man who had survived the deadliest mountains on Earth, had been killed by a piece of equipment he wore every day, a component he trusted with his life. The tragedy sparked immediate changes in climbing safety protocols. Climbers worldwide began inspecting their gear with new intensity, and manufacturers started recommending replacement schedules for harnesses, not just when they looked damaged, but based on years of use. Superman's final climb. On Saturday, August 18, 2018, 50-year-old Steve Turner stood near the summit of Mount Barney in southeast Queensland, Australia. He was with two younger climbers in their 30s, descending after what should have been a routine climb. Mount Barney isn't particularly high at just 1,359 meters, but its rugged terrain and steep cliff faces have earned it respect among Australian climbers. The section they were on, called the Governor, is known for its exposed rock faces and dramatic drops. Steve Turner was one of the most experienced and beloved climbers in the southeast Queensland climbing community. With decades of climbing experience, he had mentored countless younger climbers, taking them on their first multi-pitch routes, teaching them rope work, and passing on the skills and ethics that define safe mountaineering. His friends called him Superman, not just for his physical strength and technical ability, but for his courage under pressure and his unwavering commitment to getting people home safely. The descent had been proceeding normally when something went catastrophically wrong. According to Acting Inspector Warren Parker of Queensland Police, Turner somehow came detached from the climbing rope and has fallen a significant distance, some 300-400 meters, and has fallen to his death. The two climbers with him watched in horror as their mentor and friend disappeared over the edge. They were stranded on the cliff face, shaken and traumatized, unable to reach him or descend safely on their own. They called for help. Emergency services responded immediately, but the terrain made rescue operations extremely difficult. The cliff face was too steep and exposed for ground teams to reach quickly. A helicopter was deployed to locate Turner's body and evacuate the two surviving climbers. Around 5 p.m., both men were airlifted from the cliff face and flown to safety. rescue teams located Turner's body on Saturday night, but recovering it proved nearly impossible in darkness on such treacherous terrain. The operation had to wait until Sunday. For more than 24 hours, Turner's body remained on the mountain while crews planned the technical extraction. On Sunday night, in a careful and dangerous operation, rescue teams finally retrieved him from the cliff face. The exact cause of Turner's detachment from the rope remains unclear. Inspector Parker's statement that Turner somehow came detached suggests the mechanism wasn't immediately obvious at the scene. Whether a carabiner failed, a knot came undone, or some other equipment malfunction occurred would likely never be determined with certainty. What was clear was that an experienced climber, someone who had descended countless routes safely over decades, had died in a fall that shouldn't have happened, touching the void. On June 8, 1985, British climbers Joe Simpson and Simon Yates stood on the summit of Ciudad Grande, a 2814-foot peak in the Peruvian Andes. They had just completed the first ascent of the mountain's west face, a technical route that had never been climbed. They were exhausted, running low on supplies, but triumphant. All they had to do now was get down. The descent started badly. On the north ridge, Joe's crampon caught awkwardly and he fell, landing hard on his leg. The impact shattered his tibia, driving the bone through his knee joint. The injury was catastrophic. In the remote Andes, with no rescue possible, a broken leg was effectively a death sentence, but Simon refused to abandon his partner. Together, they devised a desperate plan. Simon would lower Joe down the mountain in 150-foot increments, using 2 ropes tied together. Joe would dig in his ice axes to stabilize himself. Then Simon would descend and repeat the process. It was agonizingly slow and dangerous, but it was their only chance. For hours, the system worked. They descended thousands of feet through the day and into the night. But as darkness fell, a storm moved in, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Simon couldn't see where he was lowering Joe. He couldn't tell how far below the next anchor point was. He just had to trust the system and keep lowering. Then the rope went slack in an unexpected way. Simon called down but heard nothing over the wind. What he didn't know was that he had lowered Joe over the edge of a massive ice cliff. Joe was now dangling in midair, spinning slowly in the darkness, 100 feet below an overhang, unable to climb up or touch down. Joe screamed into the storm, but Simon heard nothing. The rope angled sharply over the cliff edge, and the weight was pulling Simon slowly toward the drop. He tried to hold on, but his anchor was failing. He was being dragged inch by inch toward the edge. After 90 minutes hanging onto the rope, his strength was gone, his hands frozen, his body shutting down. Simon made the most agonizing decision of his life. He pulled out his knife and cut the rope. Joe fell into the darkness, plummeting down the ice face. He hit a slope, tumbled, and then broke through a thin snow bridge, falling again into a massive crevasse. He crashed onto a ledge 80 feet below the surface and lost consciousness. When Joe woke up, he was in total darkness, buried in a crack in the glacier. His leg was destroyed, he was alone, and he assumed Simon thought he was dead. Most people would have given up. But Joe Simpson decided he was going to try to survive. He discovered that the crevasse descended deeper into the glacier, but saw light coming from below. In an act of incredible courage or desperation, he lowered himself deeper into the crevasse, gambling that it might lead out rather than becoming a tomb. At the bottom, he found a gap leading to the glacier's edge. For 3 days and 3 nights, Joe crawled across the glacier toward base camp. He had no food, almost no water, and his leg was useless. He dragged himself through ice fields, across boulder fields, through streams. He hallucinated, slipped in and out of consciousness, and kept moving. Simon, racked with guilt, had made it back to base camp and was preparing to leave, believing Joe was dead. On the morning of their planned departure, Simon heard a sound outside the tent. Moaning, scraping, something human but barely. He unzipped the tent and found Joe, delirious and nearly dead, but alive. Joe Simpson's survival became one of the most extraordinary stories in mountaineering history. The book he wrote, Touching the Void, became an international bestseller, and the documentary film is considered one of the greatest mountaineering films ever made. Simon Yates faced criticism for cutting the rope, but most climbers agreed he had made the only rational decision. If he hadn't cut the rope, both men would have died. Joe Simpson proved that the human will to survive can overcome almost impossible odds. And Simon Yates proved that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that give your partner the only chance they have. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.